There's a particular kind of quiet that falls over a room when someone says something cruel out loud and doesn't realize who just heard it. I watched that quiet land at my own engagement party, the night my mother told a circle of strangers that I had always been the failure of the family. She didn't see the woman by the fireplace go still. I did. My mother was holding a glass of champagne she hadn't paid for, in a house she'd been dying to get inside of for months, working the room of well-dressed guests like the realtor she was, when somebody politely asked how she felt about her daughter's engagement. And Vivian Carver, who could have said anything, who could have said I'm proud, or even just I'm happy for them, laughed her little tinkling laugh and said, "Oh, Lena." Honestly, she was always my failure, the artsy one. Makes little clay bowls for a living, if you can call it a living. I have no earthly idea how she landed a Whitfield. A few people chuckled, the uncomfortable kind. My new mother-in-law's smile froze on her face, and over by the fireplace, a silver-haired woman in a deep green dress, who had been quietly studying a tall blue vase on the mantel, turned her head very slowly toward my mother and looked at her the way you look at a stain you've just noticed on something expensive. Nobody in that room knew it yet, but in the space of one sentence, my mother had just ended her own career. She'd been clawing toward this exact circle of people for 20 years, and the woman in green, the one she'd most wanted to impress, had heard every word. Well, Louie, before I take you any further into this, let me ask you for one small thing, because this whole story rests on a truth that took me 31 years to learn. The things people say about you, in rooms they think are safe, will always, eventually, reach the one person who matters most. If you've ever been somebody's punching bag at a party, somebody's cautionary tale, hit subscribe so the next story finds you, and tell me down in the comments the meanest thing a family member ever said about you in front of others. Get it out of your chest and into the light. I read every one, and I promise you, you'll find a whole crowd down there who knows exactly how it feels. Now let me back up and tell you who that woman in green was, and why a single look from her was worth more than every word my mother ever spoke. But first you need to understand my mother, because Vivian Carver is the whole engine of this story. My mother sold luxury real estate in Wexford, Connecticut, a shoreline town where the houses have names and the people who live in them have opinions about which families belong. Vivian had not been born into that world. She'd married into the edge of it, briefly, to my father, who left when I was 8 and took most of the comfort with him. After that, my mother decided that the way back into the rooms she craved was to become the woman who sold those rooms to other people, and she was good at it. Charming, relentless, with a memory for names and a nose for money. What she was not good at was being the mother of a daughter who didn't care about any of it, because I was always going to disappoint her. I could feel it as far back as I can remember. While other little girls were dressed up for her open houses like accessories, I was the kid with clay under her fingernails, happiest alone in the garage, with a second-hand pottery wheel I'd bought with birthday money. My mother looked at that wheel the way some people look at a bad habit. "When are you going to do something serious?" became the soundtrack of my childhood. Art was not serious. Teaching was not serious. A modest paycheck and a deep sense of purpose were, in Vivian's ledger, the very definition of failure. She measured a life in square footage and commission checks, and by that measure, her only child was a write-off she'd never managed to recover. The cruelest part wasn't the big blow-ups. It was the steady drip, introducing me at parties as my daughter, the art teacher, with a little apologetic shrug, like she was confessing a diagnosis. Forgetting, conveniently, to mention the gallery show I'd had. Telling her friends I was still finding myself when I was 30 years old and had found myself just fine, thank you, in a high school art room and a small studio that smelled like wet earth and possibility. For most of my 20s, I let it shape me. You can't help it when the first voice that ever described you keeps describing you as not enough. I shrank my own news, apologized for my choices, dreaded the question, "And what do you do?" at any party where my mother might be listening. Then I met Daniel Whitfield, and for the first time in my life, somebody looked at the exact things my mother called failures and called them the reasons he loved me. Daniel taught high school history 2 doors down from my art room. No grand fortune of his own, just a teacher's salary and a kind face and a way of listening that made you feel like the most interesting person in any building. We fell in love over bad cafeteria coffee and the shared exhaustion of people who pour themselves into other people's children. It was months before I learned that the unassuming history teacher came from one of the oldest families in Wexford, the kind of family my mother had spent her whole career trying to get a listing from. When she found out, my mother nearly levitated. Suddenly, overnight, I was a different daughter to her. Not because she'd come to value me, but because I'd become valuable. I had, without meaning to, finally done the one serious thing. I'd attached myself to a Whitfield. And in her mind, that meant the door to the room she'd always wanted was about to swing wide open, with me as the hinge. The Whitfields, for their part, were nothing like she imagined rich people to be. Daniel's mother, Joan, wore the same 3 cardigans on rotation and drove a 15-year-old station wagon and could talk to a plumber and a senator with exactly the same warmth. The first time I had dinner at their house, terrified, clutching a vase I'd made as a gift because I didn't know what else a person brought, Joan unwrapped it, held it up to the light, traced the glaze with one finger, and got tears in her eyes. "You made this," she said. Not a question, a kind of wonder. "With your own hands, you made this." She put it on the mantel that night, in the center, where it stayed. "That vase matters. Hold on to it." The engagement party was Joan's idea, thrown at the Whitfield house, a warm and slightly chaotic gathering of teachers and cousins and old family friends. My mother was invited, of course. She arrived 40 minutes early in a new dress, scanning the room like a prospector, and within 10 minutes she had located the single most important person in it, Cornelia Vandermeer. If you don't move in those circles, the name means nothing. In Wexford it meant everything. The Vandermeers were the oldest money on the shoreline, and Cornelia, widowed and formidable and somewhere past 70, sat at the head of nearly every table that mattered. She chaired the Regional Arts Foundation. She decided which galleries thrived and which charities got funded. And, most relevant to my mother, the Vandermeer family was about to put their enormous waterfront estate on the market, a listing worth a commission that could set an agent up for years. Vivian had been courting that listing for 18 months. She was, by her own breathless account, this close. She did not know that Cornelia Vandermeer had arrived early too, and had spent the first quarter hour of the party standing quietly at the mantel, transfixed by a tall blue vase. I watched it happen from across the room, and I'll tell you, even now it gives me chills. Cornelia turned from the mantel and asked Joan, in that carrying voice old patricians never lose, "Joan, this piece, where on earth did you find it? The glaze is extraordinary. It looks like the tide coming in at dusk. I haven't seen work like this in years." And Joan, beaming, put her hand on my shoulder and said, "Oh, that's no gallery find. Arlena made it. Lena's a ceramic artist. Isn't she marvelous?" My mother, standing right there in the little cluster, saw a chance and took it the only way she knew how. She wanted to seem relatable to the great Cornelia Vandermeer, to bond with her over the disappointments of the younger generation, to position herself as a fellow person of taste and standards. So she gave that little laugh, and she said the thing about the failure, and the little clay bowls, and how she had no idea how I'd landed a Whitfield. The silence that followed was the quiet I told you about at the start. Cornelia Vandermeer set down her glass. She looked at the vase, then at me, then at my mother, taking the full measure of all three, and then, in a voice like a door closing very softly, she said, "How fascinating. I was about to tell you that this is the most beautiful object in this house." She let that sit. I'd assumed the artist's mother would be proud. Then she turned her back, walked across the room to me, took both my hands in her papery ones and said, loud enough for the whole frozen circle to hear, "Young lady, your work stopped me cold. I would be honored if you'd let me show it at the foundation this spring." Before or since, watched a person lose everything they wanted while standing perfectly still, holding a glass of someone else's champagne. What happened to my mother after that night did not happen with a bang. It happened the way the tide goes out, so slowly you don't notice until the boats are sitting on mud. Cornelia never raised her voice, never made a scene, never told a soul to shun Vivian Carver. She simply withdrew. The Vandermeer estate listing, the one my mother had been this close to, went to a different agency 3 weeks later, with no explanation given. The invitations to the luncheons and the gala committees, the ones that had fed my mother's referrals for years, quietly stopped arriving. Calls she made to certain phone numbers stopped being returned. In a community that runs entirely on who vouches for whom, the most powerful woman on the shoreline had simply stopped vouching, and the silence spread outward from her like cold water. My mother never got a clean explanation, which I think tormented her more than any confrontation could have. She knew, of course she knew, but nobody ever said it to her face, so she could never argue with it, never charm her way back from it. She'd spent 20 years learning to talk her way into rooms, and she'd been frozen out of all of them by a thing she couldn't talk her way out of, because the only crime anyone could name was that she'd been overheard being exactly who she was. Word travels in a town like Wexford, and the version that traveled was not the one my mother would have written. People had been at that party. People had heard. And the story that made its rounds at the coffee shops and the marinas was simple and devastating. Vivian Carver called her own daughter a failure to Cornelia Vandermeer's face, not knowing the girl had made the vase Cornelia was admiring. In a town that loves nothing more than a tidy moral, my mother became the cautionary tale she'd spent my whole childhood trying to make me into. Cornelia, true to her word, gave me a show that spring. It was a small thing and an enormous thing at the same time. A room at the foundation, my pieces on white pedestals, a little card with my name on the wall. My students came, Daniel and his parents came. Strangers came, and bought, and asked when I'd make more. I sold enough that night to take a summer off teaching and just make work, which is a kind of wealth my mother could never have understood, because it can't be measured in square feet. Cornelia became something I'd never had, a powerful person in my corner, who'd chosen to be there for no reason except that she liked what my hands could do. My mother came to find me about 2 months after the party, not at the show. She didn't come to the show. She showed up at my studio on a gray afternoon, and she looked smaller than I'd ever seen her, the relentless engine of her finally idling. For a moment I thought, with a treacherous flicker of hope that apparently never fully dies, that she'd come to apologize. She had not. "You need to talk to that Vandermeer woman," she said, before she'd even fully come through the door. "Whatever she's saying about me, it has to stop. I've lost 3 clients this month, Lena. People won't take my calls. You have to fix this. You're the one with the connection now." She gestured around my studio, the shelves of drying pots, the bags of clay, with a wave that still, even now, even here, managed to make it look like a child's messy bedroom. "After everything I did to raise you, the least you can do is help your mother." Said Londonum. And there, at last, in a room that smelled like the wet earth she'd always sneered at, I said the truest thing I have ever said to her. "I can't fix it, Mom. And I wouldn't know how if I wanted to. Cornelia isn't punishing you. Nobody is punishing you. You stood in a room and told the most important person in it that your daughter was a failure, and she happened to be, holding my work in her eyes when you said it. I didn't do a single thing to you. You did it to yourself, out loud, the way you've done it my whole life. The only difference is that this time, the wrong person was listening." She opened her mouth, and for once the charm machine produced nothing. "I spent 30 years, I went on, gentler now, because the gentleness was finally for me, trying to be a daughter you could brag about. And the day I finally became one, you couldn't even let yourself enjoy it. You had to make me small in front of strangers, because making me small is the only way you've ever known how to feel big. I'm not going to be that for you anymore. Not the failure, and not the fixer." My mother left without another word. We talk now, occasionally, in the careful, distant way of people who share blood and not much else. She has not, to this day, said she's sorry, and I have stopped waiting for it, which turned out to be the actual freedom. You can love a person and stop bleeding for them. Those 2 things can live in the same hand. Well, that blue vase is still on Joan's mantle. Cornelia owns 3 of my pieces now, and a young couple in Wexford commissioned a full set of dishes for their wedding, and a gallery 2 states over carries my work. None of it made me rich. All of it made me real, in the only ledger that ever counted, the one my mother never learned to read. Well, here's the one thing I'd hand you to carry home from all this. The people who call you a failure are almost never describing you. They're describing the size of the box they need you to fit in so they can feel large standing next to it. Don't argue with them. Don't shrink to fit. Just keep making your work, whatever your work is, with your own 2 hands and your whole stubborn heart, and trust that one day the right person will walk up to the thing you made, go quiet, and recognize it for exactly what it is. The loud ones get the party. The patient ones get the legacy. Build the kind of beautiful that outlasts the noise. If this story found a tender spot in you, the best thing you can do right now is subscribe. Because every week I sit down and tell another true-to-life story about someone who got written off and quietly proved priceless. And I'd hate for the next one to slip past you. And before you go, settle something for me in the comments. What's the thing you make, or do, or are, that someone once called a waste of time? And how does it feel now to know they were wrong? Tell me down there. I'll be reading every single one, and I might just feature a few of yours next time.